My name is Alina Grace Whitfield. I am 39 years old, and my brother sent me a text message asking me not to come to our father's funeral. 41 words, no punctuation to soften it. I read it twice, standing in my kitchen in Columbus, the coffee maker still running behind me. 3 days later, I stood at the front of that church anyway. A pastor I had never met called my name into a microphone and asked me to walk forward. I'm a certified public accountant, licensed in Ohio for 14 years. My specialty is forensic accounting. Companies and law firms hire me when the numbers do not add up and someone needs to know why. I have testified in probate court twice. I read a bank statement the way other people read a letter from a friend, looking for what is missing, not just what is there. That training is the only reason I understood what was happening to my own father before anyone said it out loud. The funeral was held at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church, 4020 Maple Grove Road, Zanesville, Ohio. March 14, 2024, 10 o'clock in the morning. I remember the address because I typed it into my phone the night before, my hands steady, my chest not steady at all. I remember the time because I set 3 alarms that morning. That is not something a woman does when she trusts herself to simply wake up. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is where we share real-life inspired tales of family conflict, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. If these stories speak to you, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. My father was Harold Eugene Whitfield, born in 1948 in Muskingum County. His own father drove a coal truck and never owned a business of his own. He wanted one for his boy. My father started Whitfield Paving and Contracting in 1971 with one dump truck and a loan from a bank that no longer exists. By 2005, the company brought in close to $2,800,000 a year, laying asphalt for county roads and parking lots across 3 counties. I grew up riding in those trucks. Orange and white on slow Saturday mornings, a thermos of coffee held between my knees. He built that number himself, truck by truck, over 34 years. He was proud of it in a quiet way. Men from his generation usually were. He almost never said it out loud except once at my college graduation when he told me he never thought a Whitfield would sit in an office instead of a truck cab. He meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. My mother, Ruth Ann Whitfield, died in November of 2011. Ovarian cancer 18 months after the diagnosis, at home in the bedroom she and my father had shared for 36 years. I was 26, my brother Thomas was 29. After that, my father ran the house and the business alone for 4 years. Something in him got quieter. It worried me even then, though I did not have words for it yet. I had moved to Columbus in 2008 before my mother's diagnosis to take a position with a mid-sized accounting firm downtown, 92 miles from Zanesville. Close enough to visit, far enough that I was not underfoot. My brother stayed. He went to work for our father full-time in 2010, and by 2015 he was running daily operations while our father stepped back. That was the natural order of things. I never resented it. I liked numbers. Tom liked trucks and crews and the smell of hot asphalt in July, the same smell that clung to our father's shirts every evening. We were suited to different lives. For a long time that worked. I kept doing my father's personal bookkeeping remotely the way I had since college. He trusted me with it, and it was a small thing I could still do for him from 92 miles away. Every quarter he mailed me an envelope of statements. I entered them into a spreadsheet and called him with questions. Simple. It was also, without my realizing it, the reason I eventually saw what Tom did not know I would see. In the spring of 2019, I noticed a transfer out of my father's checking account. $18,000 to an account I did not recognize. I called him about it on a Tuesday evening, standing at my own kitchen counter with the statement printed in front of me. He said Tom had asked to borrow it for equipment repair on one of the pavers. He said it would be paid back by the end of the season. I could hear him shuffling papers on his end of the line. His voice sounded so ordinary, so little alarm in it. I asked if he had a note of the loan anywhere, something in writing. He laughed, a short, easy laugh, and said Tom was his son, not a stranger off the street. He did not need a note for his own boy. I let it go. $18,000 against a business worth millions was not a number that should have worried anyone, not on its own. By the fall of 2020, there had been 6 more transfers, just under $91,000 total, all to the same account, all explained the same vague way. Equipment, a permit issue, a crew payroll shortfall. Each reason sounded plausible by itself. It was only when I lined them up, dates in one column and reasons in another, that the pattern started to bother me. I drove up that October and asked to see the invoices for that first $18,000. My father opened his desk drawer and searched through it, his fingers slower than I remembered, pulling folders out and setting them back. He said Tom probably had them at the shop. He said it twice. The second time quieter, like he was convincing himself as much as me. I did not push. I sat with him at the kitchen table instead and let him tell me about the 1988 fishing trip again, a story I had heard a dozen times, and I watched his hands stay steady on the coffee mug while he talked. I told myself the invoices were probably right where he said. That night back in Columbus, I opened a blank spreadsheet and typed the date, the amount, and the word unconfirmed. I told myself I was just being careful. I did not let myself think the word I was actually circling. In January of 2021, my father was diagnosed with vascular dementia. Tom called to tell me. His voice was flat, almost businesslike. He said the doctor had run the tests after Dad got lost driving home from the hardware store on a road he'd driven for 40 years. Something behind my sternum went tight when Tom told me. It did not ease for days. I drove up that same afternoon, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached by the time I got there. Tom was granted power of attorney over Dad's financial and medical affairs that June. I signed the paperwork too, as a witness. Tom told me it was just a formality in case something happened to him. I had no reason to think otherwise. I did not read every page as closely as I should have. I have thought about that more than almost anything else since. Through 2021 and into 2022, my visits started shrinking. I would call to say I was driving up Saturday, and Tom would say Dad had a rough night, maybe better to wait. I would ask to take Dad to lunch alone, and Denise, Tom's wife, would say he tired easily now, that shorter visits at the house were better. Each reason sounded fine on its own. Stacked together over 18 months, they added up to something else. I did not let myself use the word manipulation. Not yet. Not even privately. I remember one call, a Thursday evening in November of 2021. I told Denise I wanted to take Dad to see the Christmas lights downtown, a small tradition from when Tom and I were kids. She went quiet for a moment. I could hear a cabinet door close harder than it needed to. She said that sounded like a lot of stimulation right now, that crowds made him anxious since the diagnosis. Maybe next year. I asked when a good time might be instead. She said she'd check the calendar and call me back. She didn't, not that week, not the next. When I called again in December, she picked up out of breath and said things had just been so busy with the holidays. Dad had seemed fine at Christmas Eve service, she added. No crowds issue at all. I had not been invited to that either. I didn't point it out. I just wrote the date down and the detail about the cabinet door in the spreadsheet that had become something closer to a case file than a record of numbers. In August of 2022, I drove up unannounced on a Wednesday, a personal day I hadn't told anyone about. I found my father alone in the den, television off, his hearing aids sitting in a dish on the side table, not in his ears. He looked at me a long moment before he said my name. Something behind my ribs went hollow and stayed hollow the whole drive home. He seemed glad to see me, genuinely glad. We talked easily for 20 minutes about nothing much, the way we always had. Then he asked out of nowhere if I'd heard from Tom lately. Something in how he asked it made me pause. I said I talked to Tom every couple of weeks. He nodded slowly, looked toward the window, and said almost to himself that it was hard to keep track some days, who had called and who hadn't. I picked the hearing aids up and held them out to him. He looked at them a second like he wasn't sure what they were for, then put them in without a word. The television stayed off the whole visit. There used to always be a ball game on in that house. Low volume, background noise my whole childhood. Its absence sat in the room like a held breath. I called Tom that night from my own driveway, engine off, the streetlight throwing a thin orange line across the dashboard. I asked why Dad's hearing aids weren't in. There was an edge in Tom's voice I hadn't heard before, tired, impatient. He said they irritated Dad's ears now that he took them out during the day, that it was a comfort thing. I asked if the television had broken. He said no, Dad just didn't seem interested anymore, that noise agitated him some days. I said okay. I didn't say what I actually thought, which was that a silent house and a man cut off from his own hearing aids didn't sound like comfort to me. It sounded like something being managed. I wrote it all down that night and stared at the screen a long time before I closed the laptop. In February of 2023, a woman named Carol Ann Massey called my cell phone, a number I didn't recognize, a little after 7 on a Tuesday. I almost let it go to voicemail. something made me answer. She introduced herself as a home health aide coming to the house 3 mornings a week since December. She said she was calling on her own, off the clock from her car in another patient's driveway 2 streets over. I could hear the engine humming and somewhere farther off, a dog barking twice and going quiet. "I hope this is okay," she said. "I got your number off an old contact card in his kitchen drawer." Her voice was careful, the voice of someone who'd thought hard before dialing and still wasn't sure she should. She said my father asked about me by name almost every visit. He'd ask if Ellie was coming Sunday, and when she told him she didn't know, he'd get a look on his face like he was reaching for something just out of reach. She said it happened often enough that she'd started noticing the pattern before she could name it. She said she'd overheard Tom on the phone more than once, twice while she was in the next room changing linens, talking about the house and the business in a tone that didn't sound like a son planning for his father's care. She wouldn't repeat the exact words, just that it stuck with her. I asked her directly if she thought my father was in danger. She went quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "I think he's lonelier than anyone around him wants to admit. I think somebody who loves him should come see him more. I think that somebody should probably be you." She asked me not to say where I'd heard any of this. She needed the job, 2 kids at home, she said, and she couldn't afford to lose the hours. I told her I understood. I thanked her twice before we hung up. My voice cracked on the second one. I sat in my car in the parking garage under my office for 20 minutes after that call. I didn't cry. My hands were steady on the wheel. My mind unusually clear, the kind of clarity that comes right before a decision instead of just a thought. I drove to Zanesville that Saturday. My father was in the kitchen when I got there at the same table where I'd done homework as a girl. He smiled when he saw me, a real smile, and reached for my hand across the table. His hand felt thinner than I remembered, the skin loose over the knuckles. I held it a beat longer than I meant to. We talked almost 2 hours that afternoon. He was clear more often than not, though he told the 1988 fishing story twice. Same lake, same 11-pound bass, same laugh in the same place both times. I let him tell it twice without correcting him. There are worse things than hearing a good story again. At one point he set his coffee down and looked at me directly. His eyes were sharper than they'd been all afternoon. "Ellie," he said, "I put something in the safe deposit box at 3rd County for you." He tapped the table twice with 2 fingers, the way he always did when he wanted you to remember something, a habit from decades of pointing at line items and saying, "Pay attention to this one." I asked what it was. He glanced toward the hallway before he answered, and I followed his eyes without meaning to. "Tom didn't know about it," he said. "It wasn't finished. He needed a little more time." His hand came up off the table like he might say more, and then he changed his mind. I asked if he wanted help finishing it. He shook his head slowly. "Not yet," he said, quieter now, almost private, like he didn't want the words to carry past the kitchen. Then we heard Tom's truck in the driveway, that low diesel rumble I'd know anywhere, and my father's whole posture changed. He picked his coffee back up. In a completely different tone, he asked if I'd eaten lunch yet. Tom came in a few minutes later, nodded at me, asked what brought me up on a Saturday. I said I just wanted to see Dad. His eyes moved between the two of us a second too long before he said that was nice of me and went to the fridge for a beer. My father never brought up the safe deposit box again that visit. Not once, even after Tom stepped out to take a call. I wrote it all down that night. February 25, 2023. Safe deposit box, 3rd County Bank. Not finished yet, Tom doesn't know. In April of 2023, my father's will was amended. I didn't learn this until months later. The new will, drafted by a lawyer Tom brought to the house, left 92% of the estate to Tom and 8% to me. The prior will from 2016 had split things evenly. My father signed the new one on April 11, 2023. His capacity to understand what he was signing was, by every account I later gathered, already in serious question by that date. I didn't know about the new will that spring. What I knew was that my visits kept shrinking, that phone calls got shorter and more supervised, that Denise or Tom always seemed to be in the room now, their voices audible even when they weren't speaking to me. I started tracking the dates and lengths of every call with a column labeled "Simply Present in Room." By the summer of 2023, I had an actual folder, not just a spreadsheet. Bank statements I'd pulled before my authorization was quietly revoked. Carol Ann's number, written on a slip of paper I kept in my wallet, not my phone. A photocopy of a life insurance policy from 1998, one I'd found years earlier organizing my father's filing cabinet, worth $420,000, naming me, not Tom, as sole beneficiary. I didn't know if the policy still existed in its original form. I only knew I had proof it once had. In September, my father called me himself, rare enough that I answered before the second ring. His voice was different that day, more present, the way it sometimes was in the mornings before the medication schedule caught up with him. "Ellie," he said, fast, almost breathless, "I need you to know something is in that box for you." Like he knew the window was closing even as he spoke. I asked what box, though I already knew. Before he could answer, I heard a door open on his end, footsteps, then Tom's voice. Not unkind exactly, just final. "Dad needs to rest now." The call ended before I could say goodbye. I sat on my kitchen floor after that, back against the cabinets, knees pulled up, the phone still warm in my hand. My throat had closed up in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't cry. I just sat there, breathing carefully, counting the tiles without meaning to, the way you count things when your mind needs somewhere small to land. I didn't tell anyone, not even Daniel, for almost a week. Some things you have to carry alone a while before you can hand them to someone else without them shattering on the way over. 2 weeks later, on October 3, Tom called to say Dad had been admitted to Muskingum Valley Hospital with pneumonia. I drove up that evening and sat in a hard plastic chair in a third-floor hallway most of the night, because Tom said only one visitor at a time and he wanted to be the one inside. I didn't argue. I just sat there under lights that never dimmed, listening to a soft, rhythmic beep through a half-open door. Around midnight, a nurse told me he was stable, resting, that I could go home if I wanted. I said I'd stay a little longer. I didn't fully know why myself. Some part of me didn't trust that I'd be called if anything changed. He recovered enough to go home 11 days later. I didn't know then that it was a preview, not a resolution. In October, I drove to Zanesville and went, for the first time, straight to see Reverend James Sutter at St. Andrew's, the church my parents had attended since before I was born. I had no plan when I walked in. I only knew my father trusted him, that they'd played chess every Thursday for 11 years, and that if anyone outside the family had spoken to my father honestly these last 2 years, it might be him. Reverend Sutter was tall, 60s, reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, a cardigan buttoned halfway despite the warm afternoon. His office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. He listened almost an hour without interrupting, hands folded on the desk, a chess board on the credenza behind him, 2 pieces still mid-game from a Thursday that hadn't finished. When I stopped talking, he didn't answer right away. He reached over and moved one knight on the board, a small unconscious gesture, then caught himself and folded his hands again. My father had come to see him alone in August, he said. A Wednesday morning, driven himself in a way Tom didn't know about. Harold had asked him to hold something, he said. Been specific about it, almost formal, unusual for a man he'd known over a decade. He wouldn't tell me what. He said my father had been clear about when it could be opened and the time hadn't come yet. He was sorry. A promise made to a man in that condition wasn't one he'd break lightly. I asked directly if my father still understood what was happening around him. Reverend Sutter took his glasses off, rubbed the bridge of his nose before answering. He said Harold Whitfield understood more than the people around him gave him credit for. Some days were clearer than others, the way weather changes. August had been one of the clear days. He was worried, he said, though he was careful, deliberately careful, not to say worried about what. I sat with him in silence another moment, hands folded the way his were. I didn't push. Some men will tell you everything if you wait long enough. He wasn't that kind of man. I understood even then that his silence was its own kind of loyalty, just aimed at someone other than me. I left that meeting with something I hadn't had in over a year, the sense that I wasn't imagining this. My father was still in there. He was trying to reach me in the ways still available to him, and someone outside the family had seen it too. Tell me in the comments, has anyone in your family ever tried to quietly cut you out of a parent's life while pretending nothing had changed? I read every single one, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because what happens next is the part I've been building toward this whole time. My father died on March 10, 2024 at Muskingum Valley Hospital, 4 days after being readmitted for pneumonia that turned into something his heart couldn't recover from. Tom called at 6:40 in the morning. His voice cracked once on the word gone, then went flat again, the same flat from the day he told me about the dementia diagnosis, like he had a switch he could reach for. I didn't go numb the way I expected. My legs just stopped holding me. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, phone still against my ear, staring at a crack in the ceiling paint I'd never noticed before that morning. Daniel came in from the bathroom, took one look at my face, and sat beside me without a word. His hand found mine before I even reached for his. I asked Tom when I could come. He said things were chaotic, that he'd call back with details. His voice had already started to harden, the crack sealed back over. He called 2 days later, March 12, a Tuesday afternoon. I stepped out of a client meeting to take it. He gave me the funeral details in a flat, efficient voice, the one he used at the shop reading off a work order. St. Andrews, March 14, 10 in the morning, then a pause longer than the sentence needed. It might be easier, he said, if I didn't come. I stood very still in that office hallway back against the wall and asked what he meant. Denise thought it would be less complicated given everything if I stayed away. He used the word complicated twice. Once for the funeral, once almost slipping for what he called the situation with Dad's affairs. He never said the word estate, never said will, never said money. He didn't have to. I understood exactly what he meant, and something behind my sternum went tight and stayed tight the rest of that day. That night he sent the text, 41 words. I've kept it. I won't read it here. Some things don't need repeating to be understood. What I'll say is that reading it did something physical to me. Pressure behind my eyes, a coldness in my hands that lasted long after I set the phone down. I called Daniel into the kitchen and handed him the phone without a word, watching his face while he read it. He read it twice, the way I had, then set it down gently on the counter like it might make noise if he set it down too hard. He looked at me and asked one question. Was I going to go anyway? I didn't answer right away. I stood there with my hand flat against the cool granite, thinking about my father tapping the table twice, about the folder Reverend Sutter wouldn't describe, about a safe deposit box I'd never seen the inside of, about Carol Ann's voice, engine running, telling me someone should come see him more. I don't know yet, I said, which wasn't entirely true. Some part of me already knew. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud until I'd said it to someone whose judgment I trusted more than my own that week. I called Richard Doyle the next morning, 8:15, before his first appointment. Richard is an estate attorney I've worked with twice before on unrelated forensic accounting cases. Careful man, 50s, a habit of taking notes by hand even though everything else in his office was digital. I told him everything, start to finish. The transfers since 2019, the amended will I still hadn't officially confirmed existed, the hearing aids in the dish, Carol Ann's call from her car, Reverend Sutter, and the promise he wouldn't break. He listened almost 20 minutes without interrupting, the same patient silence the pastor had given me. I could hear him clicking his pen occasionally, the only sign he was still on the line. When I finished, he was quiet a moment longer. Then he said one sentence I haven't forgotten since. Eleanor, you go to that funeral. It is your father too. Nobody gets to write you out of that room by text message. He told me he'd start looking into the probate filings that morning, quietly, before I even asked. If there was a will filed anywhere in Muskingum County under our father's name, he'd have a copy by the end of the week. I drove to Zanesville the morning of March 14 in a black dress I'd bought 2 days earlier because I didn't own one that felt right for this. My hands stayed steady the entire drive, 92 miles, a drive I'd made 100 times before, though it had never once felt like this. Daniel offered to come. I asked him to stay home. I needed to walk into that church alone on my own 2 feet. I arrived at 9:40, 20 minutes early. I parked at the far end of the lot, away from the familiar cars near the entrance, Tom's truck among them. I sat in the car 4 full minutes before I opened the door, my hand on the handle, not pulling it yet. My chest was tight, a band across my ribs, but underneath the tightness there was something steadier than I expected, a kind of resolve I hadn't felt in almost 2 years. I checked my reflection once in the visor mirror, not out of vanity, just to make sure my face looked like a woman who belonged there. Then I got out, smoothed my dress, and walked across the lot on legs that felt borrowed from someone braver than me. I went in the side door and took a seat in the last pew near the wall where the stained glass threw a thin band of blue light across the floor. I recognized almost everyone in that church. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, my father's old crew foreman uncomfortable in suits in a room without machinery, neighbors from 3 decades of my life. Not one of them looked at me directly. A few eyes slid toward me and away again, quick and guilty, the way people look at something they've already decided not to see. Tom stood near the front with Denise, greeting people in a low murmur, shaking hands, accepting condolences with the ease of a man running a business meeting. His back stayed mostly turned toward where I sat. If he saw me come in, he gave no sign of it. Denise saw me. Her eyes met mine for exactly 1 second before she turned back to the woman in front of her like nothing had happened. I folded my hands in my lap and looked straight at the altar. The closed casket draped in white, my father's photograph on an easel beside it, the one from his 60th birthday, laughing at something outside the frame. My eyes stayed dry. I'd done my crying already in private in the weeks since that call at 6:40 in the morning. What I felt in that pew was something else, quieter, harder to name. The service began at 10. Reverend Sutter stood at the front in his robe, and for the first several minutes it went exactly the way funerals do. A hymn, an opening prayer, a reading from scripture I only half heard, my mind circling back to the folder he'd described without describing. My hands stayed folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles went pale. Then he paused after the reading, and something in the silence changed. He looked out over the congregation a moment before he spoke again. Harold Whitfield had come to see him privately in August, he said, asked him to do something at this service if the day ever came. He'd promised to honor that exactly as it was given to him. He said my father had asked that his daughter Alina be called to the front, to read a letter he'd written and sealed, to be opened only at his funeral, only by her. The church went completely still, the kind of stillness that has weight to it, that presses against your ears. I felt every head turn, though I didn't look at any of them. I looked only at Reverend Sutter, who was looking directly at me, waiting. I don't fully remember standing. My legs moved before my mind caught up. I remember the sound of my own footsteps on the stone floor, unnaturally loud, each one landing like a small verdict. I kept my eyes on Reverend Sutter the whole walk because I didn't trust myself to look at anyone else and keep moving. Tom turned as I passed the front pew. His face had gone the color of ash, his jaw working like he wanted to say something and couldn't find the shape of it fast enough. Denise's hand shot out and gripped his forearm. Whether to steady him or stop him, I couldn't say. I didn't slow down. I didn't look at either of them longer than a heartbeat. My father's photograph sat just to my left as I passed, laughing at something outside the frame, and for 1 second I let myself look at that instead. Reverend Sutter handed me a sealed envelope, my name written on the front in my father's handwriting. The same slant from 100 birthday cards, a dozen report card signatures, a slant he never lost even after his hands began to shake. My own hands weren't steady anymore. I broke the seal slowly, aware of every eye in the room, aware of my own breathing, aware of nothing else. The letter was dated August 9, 2023. 3 pages, handwritten in blue ink that had faded unevenly, the pressure of the pen changing line to line, the way it does when a hand isn't quite steady but is trying hard to be. I read it aloud because Reverend Sutter had asked me to, my voice uneven at first, catching on the second word, then steadying somewhere around the second paragraph. My father wrote that he understood his mind wasn't what it had been, that there were days now he couldn't fully trust his own judgment, and admitting that in writing was harder than almost anything he'd done in his life. He wrote that he'd watched his access to his own life narrow month by month without ever being able to name why or stop it, like watching a room get smaller from the inside. He'd used one of his clear mornings before anyone in the house was awake to drive himself to see Reverend Sutter. And one more, a week later, to see Richard Doyle, whose name he'd gotten from an old friend at Third County Bank. The will signed in April of 2023 didn't reflect his true wishes, he wrote. He'd executed a new one on August 9, witnessed by Richard Doyle and a notary, restoring an even split between his two children with one specific bequest. The safe deposit box at 3rd County held that will along with the original 1998 life insurance policy, still valid, still naming me as beneficiary, and a separate letter for Tom to be delivered privately, not read aloud. Not that day. He wrote one more thing near the end and my voice finally broke reading it. He was sorry it took him this long to act. He hoped I'd understand that some of his silence these last 2 years hadn't been forgetting me. Some of it, he wrote, had been him fighting to remember. Fighting harder than anyone in that house gave him credit for on mornings when the fighting was the only thing he still had control over. I don't know how long I stood at that pulpit after I finished. Long enough that the silence itself became its own kind of sound. I remember Reverend Sutter's hand coming to rest on my shoulder, steady, saying nothing, the weight of it the only thing keeping my knees from giving out. I remember folding the pages back along their creases with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, pressing them to my chest for 1 second before I let them drop to my side. I remember finding Carol Ann Massey's face near the back, half hidden behind a pillar, her eyes wet, her chin lifted slightly. The small, proud nod of someone who'd said something hard once from a parked car with the engine running and was watching it matter now. I remember Tom sitting very still in the front pew, staring at nothing, his hands flat on his knees like a man bracing for impact that had already landed. Denise had gone pale beside him, her hand no longer on his arm, her own hands folded tightly in her lap. The service continued, because funerals do continue, the next hymn starting a little unevenly as the organist found her place again. But the room had changed. I could feel it in my chest. A loosening. The specific feeling of a held breath finally let out after being held so long you'd stopped noticing the strain of it. At the graveside, an hour later, the wind had picked up, cold for March, cutting across the open ground on the north side of town. I stood near the back of the small crowd, not beside Tom, who stood at the front with Denise. A careful distance stayed between us the whole time, like someone had drawn a line on the grass neither of us wanted to be first to cross. Reverend Sutter said a short prayer over the casket. When it ended, people drifted back toward their cars in 2s and 3s, murmuring the low condolences people murmur at gravesides. Tom didn't approach me. I didn't approach him. We stood roughly 40 feet apart for the better part of 10 minutes, both looking at the same patch of turned earth, neither saying a word. I thought about everything I could have said to him in that moment. I could have asked him why. I could have asked if he believed, even now, that what he'd done was protecting our father rather than erasing me from the end of his life. I said none of it. Some conversations aren't meant to happen over an open grave. Some silences say more than any accusation could. At the reception after, in the church fellowship hall over coffee and sheet cake, Tom finally crossed the distance between us, near the folding table where the coffee urn sat. He picked up a napkin, folded it once, unfolded it, his hands needing something to do while he found words. Low enough that only I could hear, he said he hadn't known about the letter. He said it like an accusation, like I'd orchestrated something behind his back. I didn't raise my voice. I told him only that our father had clearly wanted him to hear it too, eventually. His jaw tightened. He set the napkin down on the table precisely like the placement mattered and walked away without another word. I watched him go. I didn't follow. Richard. Doyle filed the August 2023 will for probate in Muskingum County on March 28, 2024. I sat beside him the morning he filed it, watching him review each page one last time before sliding it into the envelope for the courthouse. His pen tapped twice against the desk when he finished, a small habit of his own I hadn't noticed until that day. Tom's attorney contested it, filing an objection on April 22 that argued our father lacked capacity even in August, pointing to the 2021 diagnosis as proof any later document couldn't be trusted. Richard wasn't worried. He said capacity isn't a switch that flips off on a diagnosis date, and Ohio probate courts understand that better than most people expect. The notarized signing carried real weight, Richard said. So did Reverend Sutter's written statement about my father's clarity that August morning, and 2 sworn declarations from Carol Ann Massey documenting his lucidity through that same month, dates and details she'd apparently been quietly logging long before I ever called her back. We met twice at Richard's office to prepare, once in early May and once the week before mediation, going through my spreadsheet line by line. Every transfer, every date, every call duration I'd logged for 2 years without fully admitting why. Richard organized it into a single binder, tabbed and indexed, the kind of document that makes an argument just by existing. The matter settled through mediation, not trial, on June 17, 2024 in a conference room in downtown Zanesville. Tom and Denise on one side of a long table, Richard and I on the other, a retired judge at the head between us. Tom wouldn't look at me for the first hour. He stared at the table, at his own hands, at the mediator, anywhere but across the table. Under the settlement, the estate, valued at $3,150,000 including the business, the house and investment accounts, was split according to the August 2023 will. I received $1,470,000 in business and property value, plus the $420,000 life insurance policy that had sat quietly valid for 26 years, waiting for a day neither of us wanted to imagine. Tom kept controlling operational interest in Whitfield Paving and Contracting, the business our father built from one dump truck in 1971, along with the remainder of the estate. He was also required to reimburse the estate $109,000, the trace total of the 2019 through 2021 transfers, which mediation determined had not, in fact, gone toward business expenses. When the mediator read that figure aloud, Tom finally looked up at me for the first time all session. I didn't look away. I didn't feel triumphant the way I might have expected. I felt tired mostly. Something quieter underneath the tired that might have been relief or might have just been the absence of 2 years of holding my breath. Tom didn't speak to me during mediation beyond what counsel required. We spoke once more after that on July 9 at Richard's office for the reading of the sealed letter our father had left him, the one meant to stay private, not read aloud, not at the funeral. Tom asked me to be there. I almost said no. I sat with the question 2 full days before I called Richard back and said I'd come. I don't fully know why Tom wanted me in the room for something written only to him. My guess is that some things are easier to receive when there's a witness in the room who already understands what it costs a person to be honest too late. We sat in Richard's small conference room, the same one from mediation 3 weeks earlier, though this time it was just the 3 of us. No mediator, no long table dividing sides. Tom opened the envelope himself. His hands weren't steady, the same unsteadiness I'd recognized in my own at the pulpit in March. He read it silently, and partway through the second page his shoulders dropped, just slightly, the same release I'd felt walking out of that church in March. I won't say what the letter said. It wasn't written for me, and some things a person is owed the privacy of hearing alone, even with someone else in the room. What I'll say is that when Tom finished, he set the pages down very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid might break. He didn't look up for a long moment. When he did, his eyes were red. He didn't say anything to me, and I didn't say anything to him. We just sat there together a while. 2 people who'd loved the same difficult, complicated, quietly determined man in 2 very different ways that had somehow both turned out to be true. I haven't spoken to him since that afternoon, not out of anger exactly, more that neither of us has known quite how to begin. I think someday we will. Grief moves at its own pace, and mine isn't finished with me. Yet, I suspect his isn't finished with him either. I still have the pocket ledger my father used to track his fuel receipts by hand, a habit from a business that started before computers did the work for him. Leather cover worn soft at the corners, his handwriting filling page after page in that same leftward slant. It sat on his desk 53 years. It sits on my desk now in Columbus beside my own laptop. An old world and a new one sharing 6 inches of space. Some evenings I take it out and turn through the pages, no particular reason, just to look at his handwriting. Steady in the early years, less steady toward the end. A record of a life measured out in small numbers nobody else would think to keep. I think about the safe deposit box and the 2 clear mornings he found inside a fog that was closing in around him, and how he used both of them not to protect what he'd built, but to make sure the truth outlasted whatever was taking his mind. That is not a small thing. I don't think I'll ever fully explain to anyone how large a thing it actually is. If Tom ever reads this, and I don't know if he will, there's one thing I'd want him to hear directly in my own voice. Not through an attorney, not through a mediator, not through anyone standing between us, the way so many careful decisions stood between us those last 2 years. I don't believe our father sent me that letter to punish you. I don't believe any part of what he did in that safe deposit box was about taking something away from you or proving you wrong or settling a score neither of us ever spoke about out loud. I believe he sent it because he was running out of clear mornings and he needed someone to carry the truth forward before the fog closed in for good. He trusted me to do it without making it into a war. I think, in the end, he trusted both of us with something, just different pieces of it, sized to fit what each of us could carry. I've tried to honor my piece of it. I've tried not to let the last 2 years become the whole story of who we were as a family, even though some days that's the only story that feels true. I think about the fishing trip from 1988 more than I think about the transfers most days now, and I count that as a kind of progress. Slow, imperfect, real. I hope someday you can see it the way I do. I hope someday we sit at that same kitchen table again, not to divide anything, not to argue over anything. Just to remember a man who loved us both imperfectly and completely right up until the last mornings he had left to give us. Until then, I'm still here. I've always been here. That was never the part that needed proving.